Beautiful people of YouTube, we are so back. Hope you're having a wonderful week. I'm Yuvraj, and this is the third episode of Rendering for Design, a tutorial series where I walk you through my workflow for rendering products designed in SolidWorks using Cinema 4D and Redshift. Boy oh boy, do I have some interesting stuff to announce today, but we'll get to that in a second. Quick recap. Last week we looked at applying and modifying materials, and in today's video we'll be looking at a few different ways to set up your scenes and lighting to get your renders looking so good. Now before we start, I want to say I am by no means the know-it-all when it comes to lighting and scenes, far from it. And so for that reason I've linked a playlist down below for anyone who wants to get more in-depth knowledge on lighting, especially in Cinema 4D and Redshift, but there's more general stuff in there as well. And that being said, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Let's get straight into it. So before I jump into the tutorial, I want to start off with this piece of advice. What separates a dull render from an exciting render is contrast. When it comes to contrast, the most important aspect of contrast, from what I can tell, is light and dark. The human eye is far more sensitive to contrast in terms of brightness, so light and dark, black and white, versus color or depth. So if you want to make your images pop, really bring them to life, the name of the game is contrast, and we'll be exploring ways to bring contrast into the scene in this tutorial. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to go into this assuming that you know a bit about HDRis, area lights, and that sort of stuff. If not, here's a video on how HDRis work. So I'm going to structure this in a bit of sort of working our way up from beginner up to pro level, if you can call it that, lighting. So up here, what I've done is I've got our music player device and just slapped an HDRi on this render. So you can see we've got some nice shadows and some nice reflections from the sides, left and right. We've sort of pronounced this. Now this is again using an HDRi from that Studio HDRi pack that I showed in the last episode. I still haven't been able to find it, but if anyone knows where to find Studio HDR, then please share it with us. So this is all fine and dandy. You can see that we're missing some definition in this product that we've spent so long carefully designing. Now this is a music player, but for whatever product you have, I'm sure you've spent lots of effort designing it, and we're just not doing it justice with an HDRi. So this is the first problem with HDRIs, is that they're good to get you started, but if they're the only tool in your workbox, you will end up with some renders that are a bit too flat where they could have had a bit more life injected into them. So today we're going to try and inject some of that life back into these renders. One key thing that doesn't really come under lighting, but I still want to touch on, is your background. So I've gone here from a black background to sort of almost black, but we're getting a bit of color in there, a little bit of like tones of blue to highlight the blueness of this music player. And already it's adding a bit of life, but we're far from done here. You can just about see that we've got some of the pins of the headphone jack visible, but visible's a bit of a stretch, really. They're barely visible. I've gone and added some lights to actually highlight these details in our product. You know, a headphone jack's a feature nowadays. So we want to show that off. We want to show off our hard work where we can and engage the viewer. So this is already adding a bit of dimension, and I think this is fine for the angle that we have here. But if we want to get some more interesting angles of the product, we also have more opportunities for interesting lighting in that case. I'm going to hop into Cinema 4D. We've got the same setup here. I'm going to just check. Yeah, okay, cool. So we've got some stuff going on here. And I'm going to turn on our Redshift render view. So there we go. This will just start chugging away, give us a nice render, give us a live preview of our lights. So we've got this bottom down. We've got this sort of staring down the bottom of the product view. And it's not very flattering. It doesn't tell us a lot about the form of the product. So what we can do is start to change the angle. That's better. We can start to change the angle of our product. Or what you might want to do is, if we just delete this camera, let's start off with more of an empty scene. Delete this camera, just move the viewport to something that looks about right. I like to have mine at about something in between, like an isometric view, and then lower down a little bit so we get this sort of flattened isometric, dimetric, if anything. I don't know if is that the right word, dimetric maybe. the sort of lower down isometric view. So we're at 45 degrees. And then we can rotate our product a little bit. Find like an interesting angle. I actually want to highlight the back of the product first. So what I'm going to do is rotate it in such a way, you can even just use the free rotate tool, that we get a view of the back of the product. View of the back of the product here. Okay. So I'm going to refer you to Lukas Thorup's video on 3-point lighting and other lighting setups. That'll be in a card here and linked down below. It's also in the playlist for what it's worth. He talks us through a nice, easy way to implement 3-point lighting in our renders. So I'm going to do pretty much just that. So starting off with a 3-point lighting setup, I like to dial in the backlight before I do anything else. So we can rotate this backlight, try and get it right, and maybe use the views. But I find that until we add a camera, there's not really much point in adding different lights and things. It's hard to tell where your perspective is, especially in the other 4 views. So first things first, we add a camera, and then we can click this button here to sort of make sure that we are using that camera. We're looking through the view of that camera. For product photography, I think something around between 35 and 70 mil is a good focal length. For this smaller product, maybe a 50 mil length is a bit more realistic. So kind of sitting nicely in that range. And then here's a cool tip for getting your area light, your backlight, to be kind of perfectly aligned with your camera. And that is to hold down Shift and click area light. And that will make an area light in exactly the spot where your camera is. So if I hop out of the camera, and if we come into our render view and lock the render view to RS camera, so then it's going to use that camera, then we can come back to Cinema 4D in our viewport, and we'll see, zoom out. First of all, we have a humongous area light. This is a very small product, so maybe we want to have a smaller area light. That will do. But you can see that the area light is actually like perfectly on the camera. So what we can do is use the Z transform and move it down the Z, flip it 180 degrees. And we have an area light that is pointing directly at the camera, and it's going to give us a bit of that sort of edge separation, pulling the render from the background. Nice. We don't have much detail on the product, but we do have a bit of that edge glow, that separation, which pulls the product off the background. You can definitely fine-tune this area light, so if you want maybe fewer, if you want less reflection in the horizontal way, then you can sort of shrink it down in the x-axis. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to shrink down the y-axis perhaps, so that we've got more horizontal depth. We're being a bit more selective about those sort of edge highlights. You can just preview that in the render view. And so there are 2 different ways to get that background that I showed off earlier. There's the dome light technique, and there's just adding a backdrop and having a bit of a spotlight on the backdrop. I'm going to show you both. To start off with, let's try the dome light. So we add a dome light and yuck, that's super flat. So we'll crank down diffuse, reflection. In fact, everything apart from transmission, we'll crank all the way down, giving us a flat white background. Now, if we click add a graph to the dome light, we're going to get a node material added to the dome light, which will give us the option to add things like a C4D shader in this case. So right click C4D shader, and it's going to be here. Got a C4D shader. Okay, so we can turn up the map detail maybe to 512 or 512. I haven't found much benefit of doing anything beyond 512, even 128 is fine sometimes, but your mileage may vary. You might want to have a higher res texture. Just know that you will eat more video memory if you crank up your texture resolution. So I'm going to add a gradient, and I'm going to map the C4D shader. I don't know if you already saw, actually that was instinctive, but I'm going to map the C4D shader to the general dome map. And we've got the gradient, and the gradient is working. You can see we've got a bit of a gradient across the back, but you can't really tell where it starts. You know, we should go from black to white, and we've got a very small range in our background. So what we can do is start to crank up those positions, and we'll find it might be down the middle somewhere. Yeah. You might want to try different modes of gradient. These will give you different effects. Maybe this is something we can try. A bit of a radial gradient. I like this, but I'm going to swap these around. So we have a bit of a... Yeah, that's looking really nice. Okay. And maybe I will make this sort of bluey color. Oh. Like that. Maybe I'll make this a sort of bluey color. You can use the eyedropper and maybe sample a blue from here as a starting point and just turn down the saturation so it's not so vivid. And I don't want that. Maybe I'll make this a similar sort of blue, just a bit darker. That's cool. I think it's a little bit too contrasty, so maybe we can do this. I think maybe this is too bright, so we can bring down the brightness maybe. That's too saturated. This is more of like a pastel blue, so we're going to really desaturate it. I think the low end is also quite saturated, so maybe we can crank it down there. That's looking good to me. So something that gives the render a little bit of depth. I also want to center this. I think it's slightly off center, so I'm going to center the product in here. And the beauty of having the area light sort of pinned to our, or anchored to our camera, is that it will always be in the middle of our camera view. As long as we don't shift the X and the Y, it's going to be slap bang in the middle. And we've got this sort of centered backlight. The dome light tends to wash out any details in the viewport. So I'm going to actually turn that off in the viewport so we can't see it. And there we have our render starting to take shape. What we can also do is now add our key lights. So I'm going to come out of the camera. And for this, what I'm going to do is add an area light. And we're going to scale it down because, as we know, for this scene, 200 centimeters is far too big. Maybe make it even smaller, so 10 by 10 centimeters, just to start off with at least. And then we'll pull this away and try and go for that 45 degrees sort of off-axis look. Now, I think having it actually tilted at 45 in this case is not going to do us any favors because we've got this completely flat surface on the product. And if we angle the light almost coming in at 45 degrees onto the product, it's just going to look flat on that surface. So I want to have a little bit of, I want to have a little bit of sort of off-axis nature to that light. So maybe we can bring it forwards a little bit, where we start seeing a bit of variation in the tone of that back surface. We will remedy this like largely in a few minutes, but for now I just want to make sure that I have a bit of variation in the background tone. Okay, that's looking all right. We're getting a bit of bright highlights on the back aluminium of this product. And then as you kind of go further backwards, it's falling off a little bit. Now for my key light, I want to reduce the spread actually. And the minute we do that, we notice that the properties of how it sort of blends across that back surface change. I think this could do with being narrower. What we might do is like paint a strip of light across the back of this product. So move across. See where we start to get that interaction. Maybe we can crank up our exposure. The smaller your light gets, the dimmer it becomes. It's not sort of normalized. Maybe we can crank down our spread even further. Now it doesn't help, obviously, that we have a it doesn't help that we have a satin finish on our aluminium. Not going to get very tight reflections. Okay, so as you can see, we have a bit of an issue. We can't really focus our light directly on the product. The controls we have for our light at the moment are a bit too crude, a bit too coarse to actually focus that light exactly where we want it to be. And this is where the target tag comes in. So I'm going to right click on the area light that we just made, our key light. Maybe we can rename this to key light so we don't get a confusing tree. So key light. And if we right click animation tags, target, then we get a target tag. Now this target means it's going to point the light at whatever we would point it to. So if we bring in the music player, this product will always be pointed to the origin of this music player. If you look here, this is, that point on the back is the origin of the music player, which is, I guess, a pretty reasonable point for it to be focused on. Bring it across. Maybe it's too far away. I think it certainly is too far away. If we bring it closer, we can start to see a lot more of that difference between bright and dark. And if we really crank down our spread, maybe not into negative values, but turn it all the way down, 0.03, there we go. We sort of have to crank up our key light, crank up the exposure so it's about 6.5 stops above zero, and we can rotate the light and get sort of a so I'm going to move the light. So I think I'm happy with the position of our key light now. You can see on the left side where we have our power button and the antenna band and all that kind of stuff, the band of the outside of the music player. Our shadows are far too harsh. They're completely black. So I'm going to make another key light. Key light, make another area light. Make another area light, bring it across. If we hold on Control and drag our target tag to the new light, then we can actually it copies it over across. And we can shrink this light down, 10 by 10. And it's, again, aimed directly at that, so we're going to get really flat reflections. Maybe we can point it up a little bit. Put it up. Okay, and it's far too bright at the moment, so we can turn it down to something like this, maybe. And we're starting to get almost like a continuation of our key light round the edge of the product, but a bit dimmer, so we're not sort of distracting from the focus of the product. This is cool. Maybe we want to try this out with a different focal length. So right now we've got a bit of perspective going on with our product. We can crank up. We can crank up the focal length, and then if we pull out a bit, What's going to happen is if we pan out with our camera, then our area light is also going to follow. If we come into maybe the top view, then now you can see we've got this camera and the area light has just followed it as it dollies out. And we've got to bring the backlight once again just behind our product, so it is actually a backlight, not just in front of the camera light. There we go. Maybe that's a bit lacks any perspective at all, so we can maybe do this. And to be honest, if we're happy with this, then what we can do is bring the area light out of our camera if we're happy with its position, and we can say this is the backlight camera. We can perhaps dolly the camera in. So we're getting something with a bit of perspective, but not too much. Let's try 70. Again, bringing it in a bit more. Okay, cool. Now I think for some reason the background of our dome light is a bit too bluey, not enough green in the background. So I'm going to bring over the hue slider a bit, just so it looks a bit more color matched with the actual product. I think that looks far better. We have some green tones in our actual product. So there we are, we've injected some life into our render. We've got a backlight that really makes the product stand out from the background. We've got a key light highlighting the main aspect that we want to show off in our product. In this case, the back of the product. And we've also got a bit of a fill light so that fills in the shadows, makes it a bit less harsh in those darker regions. Great, but how can we take this one step further? Allow me to introduce your new best friend, Gobo Textures. So I'm going to add another area light, and in fact, I'm going to add it mimicking our key light or following our key light. So I'm going to hold down Shift, select our key light, and we've made an area light that is on top of our key light. And for this, I'm going to turn the spread down all the way to 0. Now we can add a Gobo texture to an area light or to a spotlight and give our light essentially that texture. So I'm going to bring in a texture from Texture Pack and say no. Okay. And maybe we can bring down the power of the light. Okay, that looks a bit weird with it just being on the back of the product, so maybe we can come in and go out the camera, move the light so that it's not quite just on top of our product, and we can add, so holding down Control and drag it onto our product there. Drag it onto our area light, sorry. Okay, so we have an interesting texture laid over the top of our product in the form of light. We've got this sort of aquatic, caustic texture draped over our product in the form of light. And I want to have our background sort of mimic that. Right now it's a bit too flat, so we can add some waves to our background and see if that works. Maybe it doesn't work. So I'm going to head into the Cinema 4D shader in the dome light texture. In Cinema 4D shader, if we come into shader and click layer, this will add our gradient to a layer, and we can add layers a bit like Photoshop, add other stuff on top of our texture, on top of our gradient. I found this to be a bit temperamental, so sometimes you need to retype in the numbers that make up, type in the numbers that make up the texture size. So do that. Maybe the scale's a bit too large right now. And then to update, change the texture size. I don't know why it does that. Still far too big, so 1/10 size. Okay, we're starting to get there. that was the wrong direction, so maybe we can pull it in this way to sort of de-shrinkify it. Okay, we're doing better. We will need some more resolution though, so maybe 1024. Okay, cool. And then if we go into like maybe wavy turbulence. And a bit of contrast. What if we make this large texture? Maybe even more. And it's going to take a second to render that texture and add it to our GPU. I'm going to fiddle with this till it's looking about right. Maybe 2.5 times the size. So I'm adding a bit of noise, trying to fine tune it so that it looks a bit wavy. Maybe something like 16% will be right. And maybe we can add a bit of blur. Okay, and then I think we should come back into this layer, and so to make this wavy texture apply over our gradient, we're just going to click Overlay. Yeah, I think it's all right, but we need to maybe scale up our waves. We can do that. See how that looks. I might want to position this maybe above the product. Just spin it around over the top. We can start to bring in some of this. Now actually this texture is part of an animated pack. So if I click animation and change it from mode simple, mode off to mode simple, and click detect frames, it's going to detect that we have 0 to 238 frames, which is, yep, that's right. And as we step through, we're going to get a sort of water caustic movement effect over our product. Again, it's very crude with this render view, but you can get an idea of is that sort of effect of water moving over our product. We can change the product to be a little bit more interior light focused. So if I come into my folder of lighting textures, I love this pack from I Go by Zach, which has a bunch of, among other things, moody palms. Let's not add that to the base. And if we bring this down, got too much rotation. And scale that up. You can see we can start to get something in the way of interesting lighting over our product. So we're getting this, in this case, like this sort of palm tree look, as if palm trees are sort of waving around the product. But if it's not your style, then you can, this is an optional step. We can bring our key light back to its full glory. And we have this simple, very simple, but elegant product render. And we can turn the noise off as well. And see how that looks. Focus on our camera, and let's shove it in our render view. Now the beauty of HDR maps is that they render stupid fast. So everything that isn't our product is going to render really, really fast. Give it a second. As you can see, the HDRi background is rendered so fast. Save image as. Let's just pull it up. Sure. So this is step 1, or let's just sort render 1. And if we open up our render, then you can see we have this beautiful sort of backlight pulling the product off the page. Thanks to the material rounding that we added in the last step, we've got these gorgeous sort of edge reflections. I'm also going to show off another lighting setup. This is inspired by Stepan HKA. His video is up here, and it's also in the playlist, link down below. So this is another way to add that sort of gradient background, among other things. Let's start off with that first. So if we turn the dome light off, because all it's doing is providing us a background, then we can add this new primitive, which was added in a recent Cinema 4D, a backdrop. And actually, we're going to use a trick I showed earlier. So selecting our camera, and then if we hold down Shift and let go of backdrop, it's going to place the backdrop exactly on our camera. So if we come off this, again, our render view is locked on our camera. We can see that the backdrop is, first of all, huge. We can shrink it down a bit, maybe 50. Height, again 50 maybe. Let's start off with 50. Let's see. Cool, and the rounding we can crank that up to 10. Anything. Okay, so we've got the backdrop and it goes right down the middle of our camera, which is why we've got this split line down the middle of the render view. We bring it down a bit and then shove it further back. Let's take it really far back so that we have that separation from our product and the background. So we can take it about that far back, and we're starting to see the edges of the, Control Z, starting to see the edges of the backdrop, so we can just make it a bit wider. Quite a bit wider, 80, sure. And I think we can do this as well, bring it down. So this is almost the same as having a plane, and so if you want, you could put a plane in place of the backdrop. I'm going to stick with the backdrop because it doesn't really matter that much. I actually want the spotlight lined up with the middle, the center of the camera, so I'm actually going to select the camera. Camera, and Shift, Spotlight. And of course it's going to flood our entire scene with light. Let's come in and just turn it down a bit. And of course we want this to be behind our product, so we're going to just drag it forwards so that it's far away from our product. We can then maybe turn the cone up a bit and the fall off angle, so we get a nice soft fall off. We can play with the fall off curve. And so here we have a white background, and that's because our spotlight is white and our backdrop is also white, or whatever the default grey color is. So we're going to go ahead and change that now. I'm going to double click, add a new material, and just drag this onto the backdrop so we're editing and we're seeing our changes in real time. And probably just going to sample a color from this material. Already we have a nice blue background. The other way to do that is to change the spotlight color. We can do both and get a really sort of colorful background, but I don't want too much color in the background. I think it distracts from the product itself. We can mess around with the saturation, so we have a bit of like this diffused look. So the spotlight makes a sort of central lighting look with a bit of vignette around the outside, this sort of fake vignette look that is quite cool, quite popular. And then again, we can choose whether we want our area light or not. Add a bit of dimension. For something as flat as this, I don't think that the Gobo texture adds a lot of dimension, but we'll look at other shapes in a second. Okay, so the render is a bit lopsided. And I'm going to change that by just moving the subject into the middle. Maybe there-ish. There. It's especially noticeable with this sort of vignette radial gradient background. And there we go. So again, we can hit render on this. If I'm not mistaken, Redshift will render this backdrop a little bit slower than it will render an HDRi, purely because there is actual geometry for it to consider and it doesn't know exactly whether there's stuff going on in that geometry or whether it's just completely plain. So it'll be a little bit slower, not massively so. And again, this will depend on your computer. So harkening back to earlier, we can see that the Backlight really gives us that contrast against the background, separating our product from what is the background. It's a lot more than just an aesthetic choice. It actually helps the viewer understand the form of the product a lot better than if it sort of blended into the back. As designers, we spend ages designing these products. It's really important that this work comes off and comes across to the viewer. Also, I want to draw attention, because this is something I did sort of subconsciously, but I do want to highlight this. The shiny metallic appearance will have a lot more definition in its reflections. So it's important for this reason to actually get some contrast in the light and dark, because you'll see that edge a lot more defined than on the satin finish or the matte finish aluminium. Given that we have no other reference for materials in this scene, the sharpness with which a material reflects light and its surroundings is actually our biggest clue to understanding how shiny or matte that material is. Okay, I'm going to elevate things one step further by adding some motion to the scene. So you don't have to add lots of motion, maybe let's say 10 frames. And in these 10 frames, I'm going to drop a null on the camera, maybe push it back a bit, not that this is actually important. So push the null back, and I'm going to make so I'm going to remove these target nulls, which will keep the lights where they are, but just mean that they no longer follow the product. And I'm going to animate the product so that on frame 5, it is in this position. So we'll exit here, we'll put the X here, and I want it to move left to right horizontally. So it will be, let's say, -4 centimeters in the X at frame 0, and at frame 10, we'll put it +4, so that it's right in the middle on frame 5. And we can go into the F curve and just make sure that this movement is linear. So window F curve, we select everything and we sort of click this linear button, and that means that our movement is linear. So if we play this back, I'm going to turn off the render view to sort of get a more real-time playback. And if we play this back, you can see it just moves at a linear pace, constant pace, left to right. Nice. And at frame 5, we can remove this keyframe even. It doesn't actually make a difference. And it's still going to be in the middle on frame 5. So frame 5 is our sort of middle point where we want to get stuff. Okay, so we're going to go into the render settings and go into motion blur, turn on motion blur, and maybe crank up our steps to about 3. And what's happened? If we turn on our render view, absolutely jack all has happened. Well, that's fine, because this is going to show up in our final render when it actually works out the transformation steps. But for now, we can add some more in the way of optical effects. So if we go into the camera, go in optical, we can enable depth of field, and immediately you can see that because our focus distance is 2000 centimeters, we are way out of focus. If we use this eyedropper and pick a distance, then we can select maybe our logo to be the focus distance, focal point. We can crank down the aperture. So if you know anything about photography, the smaller the f-stop, the larger the aperture, which means more distortion, more shallower depth of field. So if we, let's say, f1.4, then we get this really, really shallow depth of field. And this is going to be cool if you want to just do basic depth of field stuff. But to give our product a bit more motion, we can actually take the bits that are out of focus and we can distort them with a non-uniform aspect ratio. What that means is we stretch or we squeeze in the parts that are blurred, that are bokeh. And I find this gives us a bit more motion in the product render. And what we're going to try and do is achieve this effect. Hopefully editor Yuvraj has added some pictures. And I'll show you that now. So I'm going to come into Bokeh and crank up aspect to like maybe 4. And you can see immediately we've got some sort of left to right motion. Anything that isn't in focus progressively gets more and more blurry. But because we have the aspect turned up, we've got more blur in the horizontal direction than we have in the vertical. If you want to get a bit of your product in focus, then and if we leave our blades at 5, then we can get this sort of movement as if it's in motion, you know, this almost abstract type of effect. So we're in the future, the render is finished, and you can see we've got a lovely bit of movement on our music player. We've still got some of the details visible thanks to that sort of bladed bokeh design, but we can also see some of that motion blur, some of that aberration in the horizontal aspect. It has also messed a bit with our background, so this technique might be more suited to being used with the sort of dome-like technique that I showed for the backgrounds. And to be honest, that's how I use it in all of my renders. I don't really use this backdrop technique all that much. So you can see if we come back into our render view, then switching to the dome light, we don't get any issues with our backdrop being sort of distorted. So far, we've just done products in an abstract sense. They're floating in this weird space-like environment. But what about products that are showcased in something a bit closer to reality? Maybe not an architecturally accurate house, for example, but something a little bit more realistic with a bit more of like an in-situ vibe going on. We can definitely do something like that. So I'm going to switch into another scene. I have a vase that I want to showcase. We have some lovely sort of details on this vase. I think I got this from GrabCAD. I'll try and credit the author down below. And I've added a material with a bit of that rounding effect. What I've done is I've laid out part of a room. So I've got a floor, I've got a wall, I've got a bit of a skirting at the back, and this plinth that the vase is resting on. So you can see the plinth over here. This plinth with very small rounded corners. I've got a fillet of 0.2 centimeters on this plinth. So what I've got here, I've got these aspects, these make up my scene. Now, yes, you should ideally name all of your primitives, all of your objects, and layer them and put them in nulls and group them together. I haven't. Sue me. But no, on a more serious note, when you're doing quick and dirty renders like this, oftentimes if you aren't working in a team, it's not best practice, but you can get away with definitely having a bit more of a messy feature tree. Okay, so I've set up my camera here again, I've got a focal length of 70 millimeters. I've set it up so it's kind of off axis. And then let me just walk you through the lighting setup that I have here. So I'm going to lock my render view onto RS camera, and then I'm going to hop out myself. I'm going to hop out here, and I haven't shown all of the walls, so we have a couple of walls that aren't shown. We've got these. Now, there might be a case where you also want to have a wall that you can see through, but it still adds reflections and shadows into the scene. You can totally do that. If I select this wall, for example, this wall here, if I select this wall, you can see I've got a Redshift render tag on this. So Redshift object, and if you go into visibility, you can actually turn off primary ray or secondary ray, depending on which side is front or back. This will make it invisible from one side or the other. So I think primary ray makes the front invisible, but if you're viewing it from behind, you'll still see that geometry, and secondary ray is the opposite of that, basically. So definitely a tip to use if you want to have walls and stuff that you don't really need to see. And I'm going to hide them in this viewport because I also don't need to see them. Maybe this as well. Okay, cool. So I'm going to zoom out for a second, and I've got a few different lights, not lots and lots of stuff going on, but I do have a few going on. So I have a dome light, which is sort of simulating a little bit of daylight coming in. So I'm imagining this as a sort of indoor room that might open out onto like a garden with a pool or something. Stuff that is far beyond the student lifestyle, but who knows, maybe someday. And so to mimic the reflections of the water coming off from outside, I've got this rather large area light, which is using those caustic textures that I showcased earlier. And these are fully animated. So if I scroll through, the render view will catch up, but you can see that we have a bit of camera movement, but also we've got the gobo is animating, so these caustic textures are animating. If I was to actually go ahead and model the pool and add some turbulent, wavy water surface, and then add a light that then had caustics coming off it, this would be an insanely more expensive setup for me to render, and would take exponentially longer for me to render than just adding something like these gobo textures. This is a really nice way to add that extra realism, add a bit of context around your scene, without necessarily having to do all the extra computation of simulating those external bodies. You can see here the gobo key light and the dome light, all both coming from the same direction. They actually add a lot of dramatic energy to the scene, and we're getting a lot of sort of one-sided light on our vase. But I think the shadows are a bit too dark, so I want to simulate maybe having like some sort of warmer lamp or something in the room. And so for that reason, I went ahead and added this warm light. So you can see in the viewport, come in here, we've got like a warm light that's just filling in a bit of those shadows, so that they're not that harsh. And we still have shadows, and we have ambient occlusion on our vase, so we are getting those deep blacks where they need to be deep, but around here on the left side, the shadows just aren't as harsh as if we turn that light off. You can see it's lost all of its warmth and its essence. It's a lot more cold. Maybe this is the look you're going for. In this case, it wasn't, so I added a bit of that fill light. But again, this is all subjective. This is all to taste, so you can design your scene exactly how you'd like it. Now, you might be wondering, Yuvraj, where do I get these textures? Yep, sure. I told you about the I Go by Zach textures, which you can get, which have shadows and stuff that he recorded, and they loop as well, which is great. But what about these caustics? Boy, oh boy, do I have an announcement for you. So I have gone ahead and made 6 different animated caustics textures, which you can add to your lights, to your spotlights, to your area lights, however you see fit. These are 240 frames of animated goodness. They're available in 1K, 2K, and 4K, and you can download them today for free from my store. So I've put a link down below. I have worked quite hard on these, trying to get some sort of realism and a bit of movement in them. So these are all animated. They've got a bit of movement and some variation going on in them. And if these textures are at all useful in any of your projects, then I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to see your renders. And if you're an educator who wants to use these Gobo textures, feel free by all means. I would appreciate a shout out or anything, or just a little pointer in my direction. But by all means, these are free for you to do whatever you want with them. The only limitation I put on them is that you cannot redistribute these Gobos. So they are from my store and they're from my store only. Other than that, go ham. You'll be able to make some really cool stuff like you've seen in this tutorial. So in the space of... we have gone from this to this. I don't know about you, but I think that's something to be quite proud of. So well done if you've stuck along for this far in the video. So that's about it for today. We started off by looking at HDRis and using them as a sort of jumping off point for quick and dirty lighting for your scene. I then walked you through an implementation of the 3-point lighting principles. So having that backlight, that key light, that fill light, and what the purpose of each of the lights are, my quick tips for getting stuff aligned to the camera and that kind of stuff as well. And then I walked you through a couple of different options for adding a bit of spice to your backgrounds. You can either use a dome light or you can use a backdrop. There is a third option which I didn't mention, which is just to render with an alpha channel and then composite a background of your choice. We'll look at compositing later on in the series, so I'm going to save stuff like that for later on. We then looked at adding Gobo textures to your area lights and to your spotlights, and how these can add a bit of intrigue to your scene, as if there's something else going on that we can't quite see in our viewport. And then we finished off with a slightly more in situ example. Not fully, we're not looking at a super detailed architectural scene, but something in between where you've got a few architectural elements going on, like a plinth, wall, that kind of stuff. Lighting and scene design really is an endless chasm of knowledge for you to level up. So if you're interested in learning more, I've got that playlist I mentioned linked down below. If you want to know more about this technique of having lights that mimic the real world, that's a technique called motivated lighting. And there's a video here explaining the differences between motivated and unmotivated lighting. And that's the end of this installment of Rendering for Design. Next time, or in future videos, we're going to be covering render settings and compositing. I haven't quite worked out the details on whether this is one video or whether these are two separate videos, but we'll figure that out, and rest assured we'll cover the full workflow from SolidWorks right up to final renders, ready for you to share on your website, on your Instagram, wherever you'd like. Get your work printed. You should absolutely get your work printed. All right, this episode has gone on long enough. I will catch you in the next one.